I'm a 32-year-old woman. It was a couple of weeks before Easter. I lived in a small apartment in the suburbs, but worked at an office in the city centre. My work shifts were irregular, sometimes early mornings and sometimes late nights. This was one of those later nights, and I left work at 11:30 p.m. I was the last one to leave the office, so I locked up and walked out into the cool, rainy night to my car. I had been driving for about 15 minutes when the rain intensified and visibility decreased. I slowed down, driving cautiously. Suddenly, while navigating a bend, my car skidded, and I lost control. Luckily, I wasn't going very fast, but my car slowly veered off the road and into a shallow ditch on the side. The car was stuck, and I couldn't get it out. I got out of the car and looked around. It was dark and deserted. I knew I had to call roadside assistance, but before I could take out my phone, I saw headlights approaching in the distance. A large motorcycle pulled up beside me. The rider took off his helmet. He was a man in his 40s with short hair and a kind face. He asked, "Trouble?" I explained what had happened. He said he could help. He took a thick rope from his bag and attached it to my car and his motorcycle. With a bit of effort, he pulled my car out of the ditch. I was so relieved and thanked him profusely. He said his name was David and that he lived nearby. Before I could thank him further, an old white van sped up and stopped beside us. Two young men got out. Their clothes were dirty and disheveled, and they acted suspiciously. David frowned and said, "Who are these guys?" One of the men approached us and asked in a harsh tone, "What's going on here?" David replied firmly, "Nothing's wrong. We're leaving." But the man persisted. He looked at me and said, "Your car broke down. We can help you." I felt uneasy. I looked at David. He sensed my concern and said, "No, thanks, we've got it covered." The other man got out of the van and walked towards us. They started arguing with David. I was scared and didn't know what to do. Suddenly, David told me, "Get in your car and go, quickly." Without hesitation, I got into my car and started the engine. As I drove away, I saw David confronting the two men. I sped away and drove to the first gas station I saw, where I called the police. The police went to the scene, but the two men were gone. David was also gone. I never found out who those two men were or what they wanted. But I know that, if David hadn't been there, things could have turned out much worse. It was mid-February. I was 16 at the time, and every year just before the end of winter break, my dad had to go on a 2-day business trip. Being an only child who lived just with my dad, I'd spend these days he was gone home alone. Usually, he'd leave just before the break started, so I'd be in school for most of the day. But this year he left the same day our school let out for the holidays. I had the house to myself and wanted nothing more than to stay inside and chill all day. Our city was experiencing a heavy rainstorm, so I couldn't really leave the house anyway. I made some of the food that was left for me and found a new TV series to watch. I had to pause it several times throughout the couple of hours, though, because the rain and wind would suddenly pick up and get really loud. It seemed like every time I looked outside, the weather was worse. Then, around 6 or 7 p.m., someone was walking up to the front door. I could hear their footsteps on the wet pavement, and they coughed several times as they slowly made their way up to the porch. I didn't have a clue who it could be. I paused everything and looked at the door, waiting for them to knock or ring the doorbell. As more time passed, though, I could feel myself getting nervous, as something didn't feel right. I want to say I waited 2 or 3 minutes, not hearing anything, before I went up to the door and looked outside through the peephole. Nobody was there. I could see the wet footprints coming right up to the door, and then going back the way they came. I was really confused how clearly I heard them walk up, but somehow I didn't hear them leave. Also, with the heavy rain outside, what reason could someone have to come up to my house? I think the only reason I could settle on was that the rain made it difficult to see, and they mistook my house for theirs. Maybe they realized once they got up to the porch and didn't want to alarm anyone, so they quietly left. It's probably a bit of a stretch, but I guess it was possible. After a while, I'd mostly stopped thinking about the situation and was more caught up worrying about the storm. The power flickered a few times, lasting for several minutes before it came back on. Because of that, I couldn't really watch TV or anything, so I just sat on the couch and scrolled on my phone. It was maybe around 10 p.m. when, through the harsh wind and rain, I heard a thump against the house. I initially ignored it, but only a few moments later, the power flickered again. Thinking the thump might have caused it, I got up. It sounded like it was from the side near the kitchen, so I turned my phone's flashlight on and walked over and looked around. I thought it was probably just a coincidence that the power shut off after I heard the thump, but I just wanted to be sure nothing had happened. I didn't see anything, and I started to walk away. Hey, I jumped and looked at the back door, seeing a man standing on the other side. The back porch light wasn't on, so he was mostly covered by the dark. I could only see his face peering in at me. "Hey kid, would you get the door for me? It's freezing out here," he said, putting his hand on the door and trying to open it. My head wasn't fully grasping the situation yet, and I kind of just stood there and stared at him. "Kid, get the door, please." Something gave me a bad feeling. I knew better than to trust this guy, even though it was a downpour outside. The man started coughing, and I started to back up, and the man's face instantly fell into a disturbing frown. "Open the door," he yelled, banging his fist against it several times. I ran back to the couch and grabbed my phone. I then stood in the hallway and watched the man as I dialed 911. My phone was struggling to hold service and kept dropping the call, but after a few tries, I was able to get through long enough to ask for help. The man at the door continued to yell at me and hit the door, but eventually ran off. I'm assuming the rainstorm caused some trouble for the police, as they didn't make it until nearly 30 minutes after I called. I told them what I could, and I called my dad to let him know what happened. Nobody really knew what to think of it. He could have been stalking me and trying to guilt me into letting him in, or he could have actually been in need of help, although it's unlikely. I never saw him again after that night, though. Around 2016 or 2017, my friend Alex and I would always shovel driveways after heavy snowfalls to make some quick cash. Our town was hit by a severe blizzard. It was dark and windy, and snow was piling up rapidly. Our school had already announced that it would be closed the next day due to the snow, so with nothing to do that night around 7:30 p.m, we grabbed our shovels and went out, knocking on doors and offering to shovel driveways for money. Before we got our first yes, we heard a lot of no's. From the first house, we made about $20 each. We continued through the neighborhood. Many people weren't interested, and most people didn't even open the door. Finally, we found a second house and made a little more money there. Then I remember a long gap between that house and the next one that said yes. It was a small house on a corner, but corner houses usually paid more. We rang the doorbell, and the door opened slightly, but whoever was on the other side didn't show their face. However, they spoke from the other side. A deep, masculine voice said, "Who's there?" I explained our snow shoveling services to the man on the other side and asked for $50 for it since it was a corner house. There was a short silence. Then the voice from the other side said, "Oh, yes, $50 is fine." There was a kind of nervousness in the voice. I said, "All right," and then the door closed. I never saw the man's face. I turned to Alex and said, "That was weird," but we started shoveling. I started from the front porch towards the walkway leading to the garage. Alex worked on the sidewalks. I couldn't help but glance at the house every now and then, and at one point, while tossing snow from my shovel onto the ground, I turned towards a window and saw someone I thought was the homeowner. He was standing in one of the windows and watching me. Could I see anything of his face? Not really. He was standing in a dark room. I felt a little uneasy, but I tried my best to ignore it and continued shoveling. Of course, I looked again occasionally, and he was still there. Finally, I finished the garage just as Alex finished working on the sidewalks. So he went towards the front porch, but before he reached the porch, the door opened and the man inside shouted, "Go around back." Alex and I froze, looked at each other, and then obeyed his command. We went through the snow-covered grass towards the backyard gate. I opened it and pushed it through the increasing snow, which was a bit difficult. Then there we were, in the man's backyard, which had a small awning under which we stayed to avoid the snowfall. We waited by the back door, expecting him to come out with our money. We waited for more than a minute and gradually became impatient. I started knocking on the back door, as there didn't seem to be a doorbell, and the sound of a window opening was heard, followed by the man's voice again saying, "Come inside." Alex and I looked at each other again, and then I led the way through the back door into the house. All the lights in this house were off. It was really hard to see anything. I said, "Hello." A male voice from another room said, "I'm counting your money on the table." It seemed he was in the kitchen, which was connected to the room we had entered by a small door. We got closer to the kitchen, which seemed to be lit only by the streetlights next to the house. I stood in the doorway and was about to look through the crack in the door to see where the man was standing in the kitchen, but I couldn't see through the crack because he had blocked it. The man was standing on the other side of the door and looking through the crack. I turned around and acted like I hadn't seen him. I made an excuse, like telling Alex that we had left something outside. We went out of the house, and the man didn't say anything. As soon as we went out, we picked up our shovels and ran away. All the hard work of shoveling that house was in vain. We returned to our backyard, put down the shovels, and went inside to get warm and rest a bit. Alex and I rested for a while. Then it was time for him to leave. He went out the back door to get his shovel, when he came back inside worriedly and told me to come and see something. There were a series of fresh footprints in the snow. You might ask how we knew. Because a series of footprints led from the gate to the back door to the shed at the corner of our backyard. Alex quickly went inside, and we told my mother. We lived in a very poor and relatively unsafe neighborhood, so my mother quickly believed us and called 911. The police arrived relatively quickly, considering the bad driving conditions, and went to the shed to investigate. Alex, my mother, and I watched from our back window as the police brought a man out of the shed. He was wearing clothes similar to what I had seen from the window when we were shoveling that property. He was undoubtedly the homeowner. He later confessed to the police that he had intended to rob the house when we were all asleep. However, why he never answered the police at the door also remained unanswered. The police also said he was very drunk when he made this confession, which made me think that if we hadn't left his house, what would he have wanted to do to us in that kitchen?